A code was provided for Unworthy by developer Alexander Kuzmanovic Games for the purposes of this video. The best way to describe Unworthy is a 2D Dark Souls inspired Metroidvania without jumping. That's pretty much as on the nose as you can get it. Unworthy's combat, its main focus, is unfortunately nothing really special. Your main go-to will simply be to roll behind enemies and attack them once or twice before they turn around, at which point you just get behind them again or back away to dodge their inevitable counter. It's simple enough, but every single enemy and boss is handled this way and it gets extremely repetitive over the course of the game. You do get some weapon variety, but your base weapon, the sword and shield, has the ability to block attacks. When you can easily lose half your health in a single hit from a boss and have limited healing, that block is extremely valuable, much more valuable than the increased damage on the hammer or halberd. A few of the weapons you find do have uses through the world. The hammer can break blocks and open new pathways. Both of the bows can shoot bells, which can unlock more hidden collectibles. Unworthy has made the distinct decision not to have jumping. It's an interesting and bold choice, but feels misguided. While playing, I'm constantly feeling desperate for a jump button. It also means you have extremely limited movement options, and because it's a Metroidvania style game, you have to climb a lot of ladders and use a lot of elevators. About midway through the game, you gain access to a weapon called the Spirit Bow. This teleports you to the location where your arrow lands. The Spirit Bow is incredibly awkward to use. It's even been patched to be made more user-friendly, but it's still an absolute chore to use. You're basically forced to use the shoulder buttons or claw technique to use it, as you have to hold the attack button and aim with the right thumbstick. Most Metroidvanias would give you a high jump or double jump to allow you to get to previously unreachable areas. The Spirit Bow is a cool concept that just doesn't work well enough. Every time there's a puzzle where you're forced to use it, it's an absolute chore because of how clunky it is. There are RPG elements and character building. You can augment yourself in several ways. You can find hidden runes and gain customization via an atonement skill tree. Levels are all handled in a more traditional sense where killing enemies yields EXP, and once you fill the bar, you just level up. Level ups in the traditional way are actually pretty nice. If you're struggling with a boss or an area, you can grind a bit and come back to it later. The only thing you'll lose if you die is your sin, and you'll retain all EXP and levels, meaning you're not losing too much. I think atonements are implemented absolutely terribly. You need a point of atonement as well as a lot of sin to get one of these atonement augmentations. The issue is that early on, the limiting factor is by far the atonement itself. Atonement is only available as a reward from killing a boss, or from a rare item known as a Sinner's Heart hidden throughout the world. After about 3 or 4 atonement augmentations, the sin requirement becomes prohibitively expensive. The cost shoots up at an exponential rate. For perspective, at the end game I had 3 extra atonement points, and the sin requirement started to be in the 100,000s. Standard enemies in the final area give 1800 sin, and that's with a plus 20% sin rune. The path from the second to last kiln to the final boss has about 10 enemies. You'd have to run through this over and over and over again to actually get enough sin to get an atonement, at which point you've probably gained at least 2 levels, even at level 50 plus. There is really no need for the sin requirement on atonements besides gating you off from getting them too early, or realistically, getting any more of them at all. More likely, it's a takeaway from Dark Souls' soul system. With EXP and sin being separated, it creates a void where sin is completely useless for the majority of the game besides a handful of shops selling mostly useless items. If these atonements were actually strong, it wouldn't be so bad. But they aren't even that strong. A 1.5% chance to get a refill on a flask on a kill, 2 base damage? These things are borderline intangible in the grand scheme of things. You'll gain the majority of your damage via natural level ups just farming sin to get these augments, so the 2 base damage you get from an atonement is negligible. The most noticeable thing about Unworthy is its monochrome palette. It's strictly white, black, and gray with the occasional red blood spatter for effect. The graphics are intentionally simple but lack any details at all. Everything is a silhouette, for better or for worse. The character animations are very fluid and well done. The conveyance of what things are is also well done, but it has a distinct feel of placeholder art, as if these silhouettes were a starting point to a grander picture and the details just never came into play. A few of the boss designs unfortunately feel very uninspired. Simple humanoids without any kind of flair are just unexciting. Despite being a fixed palette, Unworthy does a good job of making each of the separate areas look and feel distinct. This is definitely noteworthy as a success, but sometimes things are muddy and it's hard to see something that's required to progress, like a ladder, because of how muted the palette is and how the grays don't pop out enough. Credit where credit is due though, there is a screen shake slider, and thankfully, it goes all the way down to 0. The sound and music are extremely par for the course. The music tracks are reasonable, but exactly what you'd expect from something trying to emulate Dark Souls. The menu navigation is extremely clunky. This basically makes any and all items that you can't equip completely unusable in any kind of combat situation. This means they're strictly reserved for pre-combat and they only last about 30 seconds, so they're barely worth noting. This also applies a lot to weapon switching. You can have 2 weapons equipped and quick swap between them, but to change weapons you need to go into the menu. A lot of boss fights actually require you to have a specific weapon equipped, mostly the hammer or spirit bow. If you happen to go into these boss fights without these weapons equipped, you're straight up going to lose unless you can clumsily navigate the menu fast enough to get it equipped before you're killed by the boss. Unfortunately, I have encountered a few game locking bugs while playing. One had an invisible wall show up in an area, but it was removed after I re-entered that zone. The second was much more egregious. A puzzle was simply unable to be completed because of a bug. This prevented me from being able to progress further, which prompted me into the game's Discord channel, where myself and a few others reported it, and it has since been fixed. While it's clear the developer is dedicated to continue working on the game, these bugs prevent me from thinking it's truly polished enough to be ready for sale. Since Unworthy is emulating FromSoft's Dark Souls in all aspects, it leaves the vast majority of the story ambiguous. Quite frankly, I'm tired of this. I was tired of it when Dark Souls 2 rolled around. People forget that Dark Souls had a story and a narrative, a driving force to push the player onwards. Unworthy gives you almost nothing of value to go on. It just has NPCs have obtuse dialogue and behavior for the sake of ambiguity and shock value. You're just expected to roll with the punches and keep moving forward to answers. What lore there is in the game is so gratuitously ambiguous that you won't end up with any answers and you'll be left wondering what you just sat through. Unworthy is unforgiving, but not impossible. While runes would be a great way to add depth and customization, so many of them come with a blatantly terrible downside. Many of these are obviously targeted at min-maxing players and experts. Things like increased attack speed but your damage output is dropped. Then there are ones that lower your armor but increase your base damage. This is kind of unfortunate, because it means a lot of players will simply forgo use of runes. Your survivability is usually a critical element of several encounters, and intentionally destroying part of it is not something that you're going to want to do. Boss encounters are difficult and will take multiple attempts to get through. Part of this is that the aesthetic does make it difficult to see everything that's going on in some encounters. It's often not clear what the hitboxes actually are. The color of the swing will linger, which makes a nice visual, but it makes it difficult to tell the timing window to actually dodge attacks. This is especially true for boss fights like Mildred the First Mother, where you have to manage 2 enemies. There is a fog at the bottom that makes it difficult to see where the second enemy is. It makes the fight much more obnoxious to deal with. Since bosses are all phase-based, you're likely to lose during the second and third phase transitions your first time through just because of attacks you haven't seen before. Boss encounters are definitely about learning the phases and executing them well. Not flawlessly, but doing so flawlessly does help. Completing the early phases flawlessly will definitely give you a better chance at completing the later, more difficult phases. Stamina management is extremely annoying to deal with. It feels like it takes far too long to regenerate. This means you actually have to just do a lot of waiting around. In many boss fights, as the boss approaches its third phase, they start to attack much faster and chain attacks together. These attacks must be dodged multiple times. This severely depletes your stamina and makes it so you can't attack, and that makes it even more difficult to actually finish the boss off, resulting in very bloated fights. Most games that have RPG elements will have a variable difficulty based on how much you grind. Leveling is important to a degree, but individual levels don't feel very impactful. After getting 5 to 10 levels, which does sound like a lot, but it actually goes by pretty fast, you'll start to see some more tangible results. Unworthy is a reasonable length, but does suffer from a lot of repetition. To hedge your bets on bosses, the only real option you have is to grind to level up. Otherwise, you'll be suffering through incredibly long fights dealing paltry damage and being killed in a few hits. It does also start to kind of drag towards the end as you gain access to another weapon and you're forced to backtrack even more to get more keys and access new areas before finally getting to that final gauntlet. As a Metroidvania, the map is large and does conceal some treasures to pillage. Hidden treasures are often far too obtuse to actually find reasonably. You'll be shooting random walls with your spirit bow constantly in an attempt to blink to a hidden alcove. It's annoying because, again, a simple jump button fixes this kind of thing almost immediately. Unfortunately, the majority of the hidden items are simply worthless consumables. A bit of extra sin, a pathetic heal you need to enter the menu to use, or some EXP here or there makes the vast majority of your exploration fruitless. There are some missables as well. There is an NPC which is incredibly easy to miss as he blends into the background at the very start of the game, and if you miss him, you lose out on the ability to fight the optional super boss at the end, so keep an eye out. Unworthy has a good amount of backtracking and shortcuts. A lot of the early ones are logical and make the progress and backtracking a lot easier and faster. They're very welcome. But after a certain point, these shortcuts start to become completely redundant. Massive portions of the map are simply connected for the sake of it with nothing of value inside. Literal empty hallways that exist entirely to complete a circuit rather than have some meaningful connection or at least a hidden collectible. A door you find early on in the catacombs you won't be able to access until the final hours of the game, only to find it was an absolutely worthless shortcut you will never think twice about using. It doesn't lead to a boss or even a hidden item. It's just there to fill out the map. There is a New Game Plus feature, but it feels more out of obligation to the trends it takes from Dark Souls rather than being a logical step forward to enhance the game. You lose everything in New Game Plus except your levels. You lose all your acquired healing items and you start back at 2, and you have to find all your runes and get all your upgrades all over again. Enemies are also scaled up, which means you're going to face a reasonable challenge right out the gate, as if it was just regular New Game. It turns New Game Plus into a fairly worthless exercise rather than a nice feature for replayability. Just play New Game again. At recommended playing, games either are ascended to the pantheon of games worthy of your time with a recommendation, or are forced to wallow in the miserable muck of mediocrity with a dismissal. Unworthy is okay. It's a reasonable experience, but often feels like it's held back by being inspired by Dark Souls. I was desperately trying to like it and enjoy it, but it just failed to grip me. It is an impressive feat for a one-man project, besides the sound and music, but that has never had any bearing on a verdict. Combat, the game's main draw, is mediocre, with most fights devolving into just getting behind enemies constantly to avoid their attacks. If you don't do this, the difficulty is very punishing otherwise, and requires both memorization and execution to be successful at. Of course, you can hedge your bets a bit by grinding for level ups to give you a better chance of success. If you are interested in Unworthy, and you want to play it at some point, you should probably hold back for a while and wait until all the bugs are ironed out. The developer has stated that they want to make some improvements and add features like a weapon wheel, which should alleviate the problem of entering boss fights unprepared and basically encountering a forced loss. Unfortunately, new features come with new bugs, so hold off until it's all complete. In its current state, there are just too many minor annoyances, questionable design decisions, and bugs to safely recommend it. Unworthy gets recommended playing's most disgraceful verdict of not recommended. Unworthy is unworthy of a recommended verdict. Nailed it.